My mic was off there, didn't realize. So you're very welcome to this QSR NVivo. Since I was talking to myself there, this QSR NVivo Research Network 1 hour webinar on conducting a thematic analysis using NVivo. As I said, I want to get straight down into we have quite a bit of ground to cover. We've quite a large group, so I want to get into give as much time as possible to the content. So I'll get straight into the introductions. So I'm the one on the left. My name is Ben Meehan. This is my full-time job. All I do every day for the past 21 years is work with researchers. So I'm a certified platinum trainer with QSR. And this is Simon Taylor on the right, who is an account director for QSR. He's based in the UK. And he'll be riding shotgun with me today and fielding some questions. You can post questions into the chat or on the dedicated questions area. If you post it in the questions area, we'll see it, but others may not necessarily see it. If you post it on the chat, everybody can see it. And I'm a bit concerned, given we have quite a depth of content to cover, and we have an hour, that we may not have a massive amount of time for discussion. So I'm including the 2 email addresses there, which I'll also put up at the end. So if there's anything that we get into today that you really have a burning question on, or you want to make sure we get to you, send that. You can email us, and we'll certainly get back to you immediately with the response. Maybe some links to resources and other things. So questions around the software, the licensing, access to it, different editions of it, etc. You can direct them at Simon, and anything around the training or the aspects we're going to cover this morning, you can direct towards me. So this is our agenda for today. So having done the introductions, we're going to ask you just a couple of questions around your use of NVivo and how what version you're using and how much experience you have. And then we're going to get straight into the application of a thematic analysis with NVivo. As I said, I'm not sure how much time we'll see how it goes, but I'm not sure how much time we'll have for discussion. And then we'll just give you some information about the forum, and you will receive a survey at the end then if you have any suggestions for further webinars. So that's the plan. So my first poll, it just give us a flavor for who we have in terms of your experience with NVivo, if any. So I'm going to just put that poll out there now, and we just see how we get on with that. So I suspect many of you are new users, which is probably the case. We'll know in a minute. But we're going to show you the stuff. We're going to show you the current version of NVivo, known as R1. But you could apply anything we're doing here to the earlier versions as well, just as easily. So we've about, we're almost all the votes in. We have about 70%, 70+% of new users. So many of you are coming to this for the first time. So you're possibly learning 2 things at the same time, which can be challenging. You're learning a methodology, which is what we're talking about today, and you're learning how you might apply that in the software. So I wouldn't want to give you the impression that what I'm doing today is what you have to do in NVivo. It's what you should be thinking about if you're doing a thematic analysis, but not necessarily I'm just want to see where my camera's gone there. Not necessarily a full, you may be doing other methods like IPA or discourse analysis or content analysis, in which case what I'm going to show you would be different. So this is specifically about using NVivo. There is no prescribed path through NVivo. You can do diametrically opposed methods in NVivo. You could do a top-down thematic analysis. I'm going to close that poll now. I think we've got almost everybody in. We're coming in around 78% with almost all the votes cast. So I'm going to just close that. We get the picture. So I'm saying a lot of you are come to this new, and I don't want to be prescriptive here because this is not the only way you could use NVivo. You could use NVivo this way if you were doing a thematic analysis. So having established your levels of experience, I'm going to get straight into talking about thematic analysis as quickly as possible because we've a bit to cover. As you can see, what we're talking about here is reflexive thematic analysis. Thematic analysis comes in many shapes and sizes. But the paper that's most commonly cited when people talk about a thematic analysis is Braun and Clarke, 2006. She spells her name Braun. A lot of people mispronounce that as Braun, and she's very cranky about that. She likes to be called Braun and Clarke. 2006 is the paper that most of you would refer to. It's a very widely cited paper. And in there, they set out the guidelines. But they published a second paper in 2020 where they brought out, basically, the paper was brought out, they published the paper to address common misperceptions and misunderstandings around reflexive thematic analysis that they would see coming through peer review papers, supervisors, PIs, written comments that they have seen, on emails, etc., over the years, where they would, feel that they are misunderstanding what thematic analysis actually is. So the paper in 2020 sets out to address. It's a well worthwhile. If you're coming to a thematic analysis new, think seriously about reading those two papers. Send me an email if you don't have them. I can send them both to you. Because one is very, you should read the 06 one first and then read the 2020 one, because it corrects a lot of the misperceptions that people have drawn from the 06 paper. And it also, they revisit the 6 stages that they originally set out. Now, they don't fundamentally change them, but they have reworded them slightly. And so if I were writing, the audit trail for thematic analysis now, I'd be using the 2020 paper as my guides. And I think it's important to say that this looks like there are 6 stages to the process, and this does look very much like kind of a linear process, and it's not. And the two things that Braun and Clarke would be very big on is, first of all, saying that it is more of an iterative process. You may start off with phase 1, you may do a bit of coding, and you may even go back to phase 1 again and do a bit more familiarization. So you're working away along a continuum, but you're not necessarily doing it in a sequence like as strict as that. And the second thing that they're very big on is that these are adaptive. These are guidelines. They're not rules. So they can be adapted around your own study according to your own needs. Every study is different. The type of data you're working with is different. So you can adapt these. These are not hard and fast rules. But the advantage of using NVivo for a thematic analysis is that you can show that you adhere to those processes in a much more visual and easy to follow way than you can if you do it on paper. It's not that you can't do it on paper, it's just very easy to do it if you do it in an electronic environment. So the principal reason for turning to NVivo for your thematic analysis, apart from efficiency, and you'll see as we go along, there's going to be quite a bit of efficiency brought into the process, but it's transparency. It's that ability to show your workings, to do an audit trail. And one of the big advantages of using NVivo is how easily you can produce an audit trail. And if you took nothing else out of this session today, take this. The most important task you will do in most research endeavors, whether it's publishing a paper or writing a thesis, is your audit trail. Because that's how you get credibility as a researcher. Because if I'm your extern or your reviewer, I don't have your data. I have to take your word for it that the data says whatever you say it says. So the only way I can make a value judgment as to the veracity of this piece of research is by looking at your processes, not your outcomes. So as an extern myself and a reviewer, I wouldn't even read your findings if you hadn't convinced me in the methodology that they were worth reading in the first place. So it's in the methodology and the audit trail that you get your stripes and your credibility, and by extension, trustworthiness and plausibility to the findings. So, so we're going to show you how those 6 stages might actually work using NVivo. We're going to be working through each of these in a slide, showing you the actual guidelines from Braun and Clarke and the equivalent tasks you might want to do in NVivo. And again, I just want to be clear, some of these tasks will appear in several slides because we're not saying this is the point where you have to do annotations. We're saying it's something you might want to do at this stage, but you might also want to do it at a later stage. So it's just the various options that you might have and how you might use those in NVivo to, directly opposite each of the activities would be an NVivo transaction, if you like. And we're going to work through each of those, but we're going to be dipping in and out of the software to show you how that actually works. So the first stage is familiarization and writing familiarization notes. So that's really immersing yourself in the data. By the way, in the handout, which is there you can download the handout. It's a PDF of this slideshow. There are notes at the bottom that are actually taken directly from those two papers that will, kind of just clarify what we're talking about here, just a bit more depth to it. So it's looking at your transcripts. You might even be thinking just in very broad terms about what codes you might be thinking about that might start to come up in the next, when you actually start to proactively code. And how that would look in NVivo is it would look, so this is the version R1, as I said, but you could do this in older versions just the same. And we're using the tutorial that comes standard with NVivo, except we've adapted it obviously for this presentation today because you could do any method in NVivo. So if you wanted a copy of this project file, again, send me an email and we'll send you a link back. You could download this, but you would have to have R1 to run it. So you would start off by importing your data in the normal way like you would with any other project. But as you immerse yourself, sometimes you might do NVivo transcription because some people like to automate that process and then do the corrections yourself to familiarize yourself with the data. Some people transcribe verbatim from the audio. You can do that inside or outside of NVivo. If you do it within NVivo, you'll get synchronization between the text and media. So you can now listen as well as read passages of text. But the other important area is making notes. And they would take two forms, annotations and memos. And if you look at the literature going back into the 40s on qualitative analysis, whatever guidelines you're talking about, whether it's IPA or thematic analysis, the three things they talk about in those books are indexing, annotating, and memoing. So they feature very large in most methodologies. So indexing is coding, which we're coming to. Annotating and memoing are what we're going to talk about now. So as part of the familiarization process, you might start to make notes, just clarifying your own thoughts, coding assumptions, thoughts and ideas, or even field notes and observations if there was something in the transcript that wasn't fully apparent. Somebody becoming emotional, for example, may not be obvious in the text. So annotations are a tool in NVivo that you can very quickly add notes to text. So I could just right click here and make a new annotation and I can type my note. And that, it's a bit like an embedded comment in Word. It's going to embed the text. It's going to embed your comment into the email and appear at the bottom of the page. So as you click, if you look at the bottom of the page down here, when I click into the next annotation, the note changes. So I'm reading this and I'm thinking Barbara really has a strong sense of place, and I'm making a note of that. And then the other tool that I might want to use in a more broader sense than an annotation, which is specific to a comment, is a memo. So down here in the notes area, now I'm assuming, like today assumes a certain level of familiarity with NVivo, and I know you may not have that. We wouldn't have time to cover a complete, I mean, this is a 2-day course essentially, crammed into an hour. So we won't be going into the mechanics too much, but you'd learn this stuff fairly quickly. Down here in the notes area is where all this soft data that we want to link into the primary data would be stored. And you see here there's a folder called memos. And it's been organized into the different stages of the process. So we have memos at various stages. So my initial thoughts might be recorded in a memo because it's not about a specific comment. It might be about the whole of Barbara's interview, or it might be about several interviews. It may not even just be about Barbara. So memos have a broader sense. If it was specifically about Barbara, I could link that memo to Barbara's interview. But this is just kind of a list of initial thoughts on coding. So it's just a general memo, so it's not linked to anything. But it is embedded in the phase 1 folder because it's about this early stage of familiarization. So using annotations and memos, I would start to become familiar with the data. And as I said, some of that may involve transcribing myself, or partially transcribing, or just reading and annotating and memoing. I may also want to do a mind map. If I'm more of a visual person, then I might want to look at the same thing, but in a different way. So if I go down here to my maps area under visualizations, here's my early thoughts on coding. Having read through and become familiar, I might start thinking about what are the areas that are emerging the most. Now, this is what's known as a mind map. It's not connected to the data in any way. It's abstract from the data. So we're seeing here just general observations. We're saying, well, they talk a lot about the community, they talk a lot about the economy, and they talk a lot about the natural environment. And then there's kind of broader areas that don't seem to be connected to anything, but are somehow coming up a bit as well, like policy and tourism. We're not quite sure where they fit just yet. So that kind of early thinking, and some people prefer that more visual view. And these again they're all, they're in this area called maps, and they're quite easy to work with. You'll see that they're reasonably straightforward. Now, anything we show you today, by the way, we would have tons of resources on in terms of videos, tutorials, how to do things. We'll show you at the end that there's a lot of resources you can access free, and then there are also paid ones. But you could learn this stuff quite easily. Nothing we're going to show you today is particularly complex in terms of the software. So I'm now happy enough that I'm now immersed in the data, and I've done my list of codes. I'm thinking about where I'm going next, but I'm also looking at familiarization. And the next logical stage from there would be to get to stage 2, where I start to do some proactive coding. So this is where I'm getting into a bit more work, really, in terms of it's less head work. There's a physical activity involved. So down here in my coding area, we have divided up folders for each of the stages. In fact, in practice, I probably wouldn't have a familiarization folder, because that's something we're doing really. It's not coding. I wouldn't necessarily need that as a coding folder. I just put it there so we have the full 6 stages. But now we're looking at some kind of systematic coding of the data. So you would be opening up your transcripts, and you would be developing codes based on the content of the interviews or whatever kind of data you're working with. So the physical act of coding, it's not time consuming. I'm just going to switch off those annotations. It's more the thinking that would slow you down. But if I see a comment and I think it belongs, this is something to do with the environment, then I would highlight that passage of text and I would drag it into the environmental codes, wherever they belong, and I would pop them in there. So coding is quite quick. I could also code just using a picking list. This is talking about fishing, but it's also talking about habitat. So I can throw it into several codes. So I end up with generally non-hierarchical codes. I'm using descriptors liberally because I like to keep my coding labels reasonably snappy so I can find things more easily. But also I know that some of these codes will be highly descriptive, where they talk about landscape. Some will be more, I suppose, implicit meaning rather than, more interpretive aspect to it. So I'm putting in longer explanations to help me understand what this code actually means, and that I can also, it looks a lot better in my code book later on when I publish it if I can show coding consistency. That if I can show I didn't think community change meant one thing today and something completely different tomorrow. So I develop these codes. I'm not organizing them into hierarchies. I'm not making an arbitrary decision that something is more important than something else. I'm on a voyage of discovery here. This early stage is exploratory. I'm not even really thinking about the research questions and aims of the study. I'm letting the data do the talking. So some of these codes may be expected because I would have had an interview schedule probably, but some of them may also just come up organically in the data, unexpected, but we still create them anyway. So that's my phase 2. I've now done some systematic coding. And the tools in NVivo then would be this. This kind of coding is referred to in various ways in literature. Sometimes it's open coding, broad brush coding, so there's different ways it's described. I'm using my descriptors. I might do some searching just to see, well, how much is the environment coming up? Now, I know I can't rely on that. I still have to do human coding. This is largely a researcher-led activity because I know that people will talk about the environment but not use that word. So it's meaning I'm coding for, not words. But I might just do some exploratory text searches just to see, well, how pervasive are comments about industry in this discourse? And I could gather those into a code if I wanted to as well. And of course, I might document my coding strategy, these 6 stages of Braun and Clarke, as a memo and send them to my supervisor so she can say, well, this is, I mean, the big benefit of an audit trail is that you can make, through your audit trail, 2 statements to the academy. First of all, I did it. I did the work. I didn't just say I did it. Here's the code book. Here's the evidence of my processes. And 2, I did it in a manner consistent with some guidelines from literature. So different methodologies, in this case, Braun and Clarke, 2006, 2020. So if I can just do those things, just publish my code book, show some best practice of annotating and memoing and gradually going from the descriptive to the interpretive to the abstract as I go through my thematic gears, well then I've already met a publishing standard. I've already met an academic standard. I could happily go in and defend my PhD on that basis. There's plenty of rigor. This could not be more transparent, it could not be more systematic, and it could not be more rigorous. And yet we can be as creative as we want at the same time with our visualizations and our maps and our themes. So I'm happy now that we've done some systematic coding, but now I need to move into organizing some initial themes and collating the data. And you can see the tool list is getting a little bit longer here. I'm interested in developing my themes, so I might have to do some sorting and mapping of the coding. And I may have to do some further coding. And I may want to explore that with some visualizations. So in NVivo, that would be, we now start to see some kind of a structure coming into our coding. So I started to group all of these codes around a broader theme around sense of community. Some of them are more standalone, like policy management. They are for now, at least. And these are all various codes where people talk about the natural environment. And because I'm looking at themes, I am interested in reoccurrences. It's not exclusively what I'm interested in, but I am interested in the degree to which things are reoccurring. So I can see over here on the right, particularly if I sort in any of those columns, that when people talk about a sense of community, it really distributes quite evenly between change, a local identity, and local connections. They talk about them they don't talk about local knowledge nearly as much. So I'm getting a sense of where the data is or isn't, using my participant's voice as the guiding criteria. So it's their voice I'm interested in. And I can see when it comes to natural environment, water quality is right up there, because fishing is one of the big industries. So obviously water quality is hugely important, and that's evident in the data. So it's very important that I trust my coding. It's very important that I do human coding here. I can augment that with some lexical searches if I want to, but I have to be able to trust that the meanings that are captured, regardless of the words that were used, are correct. So I would be annotating, I'd be describing my nodes. So now I have, I have a clearer sense here of what initial themes I might want to start thinking about. Now, these tools will come up later in analysis, but just some of them, we've seen one kind of map, which is a mind map, which is not connected to the data, but I might start wanting to do concept maps, because a lot of people are visual. They like to just see, visually how something is working. So down here in the maps area, let's say we're now thinking about, progression of our coding. So I'm looking at the coding structure, and I can see I've got these groups of codes now, which I didn't have before. And I can also see that some of them are kind of hanging in there. And what's balance? I mean, is balancing the balance between the economy and the natural environment? So I may have to explore that, and I might want to define later on in analysis how these things relate to each other. But at the moment, I'm really just thinking about, my initial themes, and I can see, basically there's the economy, there's the natural environment, there's a sense of community, and they're emerging to come up to me. At least I'm identifying those as themes that I think are important now relative to my research question and the aims of my study. So whether you're a visual person or you like to see it in list view here, will be just down to your own style. But if I look here, I can see the same information, but in a more kind of, I suppose, structured way. So it depends which kind of view you prefer. And I still might be doing other comparisons. I'm not going to get into coding comparison just yet. I'm going to do that more when we're more involved in the analysis. But I am looking at list view. I am writing memos. We've just seen an example of a map. I might do some searching, and I might do some comparisons, which we'll come to later as well. But most of this work is actually researcher-led. So I may or may not use those additional tools too much. Nothing to say I couldn't. I might want to just explore things. But I might want to do a code book, for example. So a code book would be that where I want to explore I want to send my list of my initial themes to my supervisor. We want to have a conversation with her about how I'm seeing, what themes I'm seeing in the data. So I could export my codebook. Now, obviously, we have 6 stages. I'm only interested in phase 3 at the moment, so that's all I'm going to send her. I could send her them all. And I'm going to include the number of interviews and the number of times within those interviews these things come up, because for themes to be themes, they should be reoccurring. So it's no harm to look at, have a sense of how much these things are reoccurring. So if I say OK to that, it's going to fling that off out into a Word document for me, which will look like this. So I can see that the subcodes are indented. I can see my descriptors. I can see all my typos now. Thank you very much. And I can see just the levels of coding, as one form of kind of forming a view of what's happening in the data. So we can export and report outside of NVivo without our colleagues having NVivo. I could send out coding reports. I might want to print out all of the comments around water quality or the habitat. And if I open up the code, I'd see everything there together. I could send that off out into a Word file. I could send it as a PDF. So there's a whole lot of ways that I can send out this information. It's grouped here by source. So these are all the various sources that have informed the discussion on the habitat. Some of them are documents and some of them are interviews. Some of them are media files, some of them are transcripts. I can see a summary here of all the different contributors to this discussion and indeed how much they contributed. And I can see it by individual here. So here's anywhere in Barbara's interview where she talks about a habitat. I can see any of the documents that I've coded. This could be literature, could be policy documents, could be newspaper reports. I can see any images that have supported my analysis. I listened to any of the audio tabs that I brought in. I'm not just relying on transcripts necessarily. I can also look at video, and I could also have questionnaires. So I can blend all of these things from all these various sources into around a single central concept around habitat. So I'm happy enough that I can produce, think about, reflect, and report on where I am at this point with my initial themes. And my supervisor may have contributions to make along where I'm going with all of this as well. And I can give it to her in various visual forms like a map or a table or whatever way she wants to see it. Now I'm ready to move on to the next stage, which is the penultimate stage really. Well, there's 6 stages, but in terms of coding, developing and reviewing my themes. So I'm getting down to, more towards the business end now. So again, there's notes at the bottom of these to show you what Braun Clarke actually say about this. These are just snippets, but reading all the references consistent with the coherent patterns, creating a thematic map. So these tools might come into play now, like coding stripes. I might do some further coding on. I might break down a code that's quite large or not, that's quite diverse in content. Lots of people talk about the environment, but they might be saying very different things. So I can break those down into more refined codes. We might look at some other maps and we might look at some diagrams. We will be looking at all of these at some point, but I just want to talk to you about the coding stripes because I think they're useful at this point to get a sense of where things are. As I develop now a tighter framework again, we're now down to half a dozen broad areas. And Braun and Clarke, I keep saying Braun, sorry, Braun and Clarke regularly talk about letting go of a theme. And that is quite hard for researchers to do. But letting go of a theme is part of the process because we're really getting into data reduction mode and consolidation mode now. We want to get down to what's important and what isn't, really in terms of the research question. So let's talk about coding stripes for a second, just to see how you might take a review and take a view of, well, here's my, I'm starting to review, and some of that might mean merging, it might mean renaming, it might mean distilling, it might mean clustering, or letting go altogether. So I want to review my coding. I want to see, for example, in Barbara's interview, how is she represented across these? Is that representative of her contributions in her interview? So I can switch on, I'll just switch them off for a sec so I can show you. I'll switch on the coding stripes here to get a view of what's coded to this interview. So I'm going to do coding stripes, not for everything, or selected items, because I don't want to see everything. I just want to see in phase 4 what's coded there to Barbara, because that's I'm now getting down, to kind of reducing the data to the key areas. So as I move across here, I can see these coding stripes appear. So Barbara has a whole piece here where she talks about the local connections. When I click on that brown stripe, it'll highlight this in brown anywhere in the document where Barbara talks about local connections. It's only that one passage.
Ben, it's Simon. Can I just interrupt you 1 second? Only because there's a little bit of confusion with a couple of the questions that have come up. Just wanting to clarify, when you mention the word references, what is it specifically that you're referring to? I think it's just a terminology thing, but I just wanted to clear it up now before it became
absolutely. Yeah, very good, thank you. So references are here. So Helen has 83 codes that she's been coded to, and within those 83 codes there are 293 references. If we're talking about text, a reference would be a text segment, often referred to as a unit of meaning. But it could be media, it could be from a PDF, so it doesn't have to necessarily be a text file. But every time I code a passage of media or a passage of text to a code, that counts as a reference. And so that's what we mean when we talk about references. But they would be referred to more broadly in literature as units of meaning or unitized text segments, that kind of thing. So I see a comment there that they can't see the notes in the PDF version of the PowerPoint. I'll check that they're visible there. If they're not, we can, if you just send me an email, I'll send you a link back to one that contains the notes. I thought it does, but I didn't check that. So the nice thing about the stripes is that I can do a few things with them. When I click on a stripe that represents a theme, obviously the stripe appears opposite the theme or the text segment that's coded there. And it highlights anywhere else in the document where positive comments were made. So just get a sense, is Barbara's commentary generally more positive or negative? Now, the way these default is they come up like this in a kind of vertical, so that you kind of see everybody in a workshop going like this when they see the coding stripes. I can display these like that if I want to see them horizontally, but it does take up more room, so I do have to do more scrolling then to be able to see them. So I personally prefer them that way, but it means if I hover over them, I can still see that I can see the full title of the code, and I could say on code a reference from here if I thought that was a mistake. So the coding stripes allow me to get a visual representation in the document of what's coded and where that document is coded. Or in a theme, if I open up a node or a code, then the content of that code would be represented where else that data would be represented in other themes. And that can be also very useful to see, because overlapping codes can mean overlapping concepts. So again, I could do exactly the same thing here. Show me the coding stripes, not for everything. I'm really interested just in phase 4 at the moment. So I'll just put them on for those. And it'll show me anything that's coded anywhere here at phase 4. And again, so people who talk about balance also talk about the economy, and they also talk about the cost of living, and you'll find that there's also comments about the environment, the ecosystems and landscape. So the balance they're talking about clearly is between industry, the need to work and to create wealth, against the natural environment and the damage that might do. So we're getting a bigger picture. We're getting to see, using these various tools, different views of the data that either confirm or we reevaluate our themes and sub-themes, and we move them around as may be necessary. So having done this careful review, the next stage is to refine, define, and name our themes. So this is, you can see the tool list is quite short here because this is primarily a researcher-led activity. So we're going to do analysis of these. We're coming to that in a minute. We're going to develop a thematic framework that we're happy with, and we might even order it in the way we wish to present this in our argument. So back in NVivo, we now move to phase 5. And we're really down, we've brought it down now to 4 themes. This is about the economy, the natural environment, it's about development and how that development impacts on the community. So we've got our 4 major themes, and we have our elements, our sub-themes, if you like, in here. So you can see that when, Braun and Clarke talk about writing memos, we're still in memo mode. We're still writing summaries against each of our themes. We might also be looking at, we haven't really looked at these in any depth today, but see also links would allow us to make connections out to literature and policy and other wider arenas. We're obviously looking at our memo, and we're still refining and changing our code book. So this is very much finally getting down to here's the sharp end of our analysis. This is our defined and named themes and their sub-themes that inform those. At this point, I'm ready now to move into analysis, because all of those things have been informing really the organizing of the themes, the developing them, the refining of them, the reviewing of them. But now I'm coming to a point where I need to start actually producing the goodies. I need to start doing some analysis and some writing. And as Pat Beasley says in our article, and in several of our books, in fact, writing is the catalyst very often. In fact, Braun and Clarke say this as well. Writing is often the catalyst for the analysis. It's when I start to write about something that I start to think about the various kind of questions I want to ask and report on. So you'd see one difference here in the final. These are the same 4 themes, but now they're just ordered logically into the order in which we want to present them. Because if you're presenting a paper or presenting a dissertation, the pages, it's a 2-dimensional thing. So there has to be a sequencing of the reporting. So we're going to start off by talking about the community. That's going to lead us into a discussion on the economy, which in turn the impact of that on the natural environment and how all that will infect the future and the development to come. So we now have I suppose the process would be we might start to attach memos to our themes. Now you could do this systematically by doing each theme initially, or you might just write a general master memo on the whole lot. So I can right click here, I can do a memo link, I can open the linked memo. And that's a physical document that I can attach, just like a Word file, and I can start to write here. I can open up my codes, I can look at the content, I can write a summary of them. But that's only one aspect of analysis. I mean, obviously I can say what people said about community attitudes and about the sense of community down east. I can write about that. I can summarize it. I can pull in my illustrative quotes. You might have seen back here at the very early stage, we had a theme called memorable quotes, which is a useful little code to have because it just means we can drop nice juicy ones there as we're seeing them, so we get the better ones to use in our report. But that's one aspect of it. And you see here, if I go back into the final slide here, there's a much bigger shopping list here in terms of the things that you might want to do to support this analysis. So yes, you're still in memo mode. We're just showing that. You might be still exporting codes and reporting. Framework matrix. Some people like this as a way of as a data reduction strategy. Now this is not to be confused with framework analysis, Ritchie and Spencer, 1994. That's a different, it's a complete whole approach to data analysis. One of the tools for framework analysis is called a framework matrix. And again, we don't have the time to go into the mechanics of all of this. We would have videos on how to do this, but I've saved one in here just to give you an idea of how it works. So let's say I'm writing up my phase 6 codes. There are memos. I'm writing up my phase 6 codes, and I want to write about the natural environment. Down here then, in my framework matrix, which is stored in the notes area, if I open this up, the framework, this is known as the framework grid. And it can be a useful way for, if you have a lot of data, for reducing this down into more manageable proportions. So what you're seeing here in each of the rows is a case. So there's Barbara, there's Betty. That case obviously contains everything Barbara said about anything. And then these columns here are our water themes, our natural environments themes, sub-themes if you like. So they talk about water quality, they talk about habitat. If I click into cell A here for Barbara, what I see on the right is anything that Barbara said about water quality anywhere in her interview. anywhere that's coded from Barbara to water quality. And I write summaries here. I can automate this to an extent, but I also might want to add, so I will do what they call an auto summarize, but I might also want to add my own highly summarized notes. So this link here is known as, what this link does is it's known as a summary link. It's when I click on that, I have a note here. It's critical to maintain the water quality. That's a summary of what Barbara says. And if I click on that, it's going to highlight anywhere in the document where Barbara made that point. And there are 4 different occasions in Barbara's interview where she said that, stressed the importance of water quality. So I can start to write summaries against each of Barbara's themes as a kind of within case analysis. And then I can do summaries downwards to do kind of a cross case analysis to see the extent to which that reoccurred in other cases. And then I can summarize my summaries. And these can become your memos. These can be a way of reducing the data and writing about what people said. So these are the various tools in NVivo that you might want to get to know. You might need some training or support to get used to these things or to understand them fully. It'd be well worthwhile investing in it because they are very powerful tools to help you see the data in different ways and to work the data. I might want to do some charts. Now, some people love these, some people hate them, some people think they're too positivist. So these are just options we're laying out for you here. But I might want to look, for example, when I look at the natural environment, I might want to get a view of just the general weighting of the data relative to, now I can see it here, and I could even produce it in tabular form, but relative to each other, I just want to see how these topics did. And I have a quick visual that I can do in here that would allow me to look at the hierarchy in a couple of different formats. So I can see it here as what they call a tree map. This is a sunburst. I think it's a little bit nicer. If I click into that, I get to see, I can include the number of references or the number of items like interviews, or I can apply colors. But this is showing me in a more visual way, look, you know, no matter what we're talking about here when it comes to natural environment, there's going to be some discussion around water quality because that's the huge area. It's not that landscape isn't important or habitat isn't important, it's just that relatively speaking. So there's no numbers in here. We're not reporting on absolute numbers. We're reporting on reoccurrences and relativity. So I get a sense there of what's just a more visual representation of the same thing. Another thing I might want to look at, so I can look at what was said. I can also look at how much of it was said, ergo that last chart, all informing my memo. But I might also want to know who said it. Now, we're not going to get into cases and classifications today because that's a whole other webinar. But if you understand cases and classifications, then you can start to look at voice distribution across your thematic scheme. So let's say people here are talking about community change. There's quite a few comments going on about it. I want to know who's talking about it. If I right click on it, I could do visualize a hierarchy, chart node coding by attribute value. And I'm going to select a person demographic, age group. There's a lot of other things I could be comparing this against. I'm going to take out anything that's unassigned or not applicable. I don't, if someone wouldn't tell us their age, fair enough. We just want to look at the ages that we do know. And now I can see that most of the discourse coming from around community change is coming from the older age group, particularly the higher end of that age group. And if I want to know, I can see that 70 to 79-year-olds are saying a lot more than the younger people. But are they saying more of the same, or are they saying something entirely different? If I drill down by double clicking into that part of the chart, I can see the text behind it. So the visual shows me, you know, a pattern in my data. And then the highlighted text here, they're 70 to 79-year-old comments. The other ones are not highlighted. I can see from a qualitative perspective what they're actually saying as well. And is that the same or different to other people? And, whoa, my chart just went ape there on me, sorry. Sorry. Now, that just might mean I've got more older people in my study. But actually, if I go down here to my case classifications, which is not just for people who talked about community change, but for people, for the entire study population, this is who I have in the study. It's kind of like a baseline, if you like. That's who I have. And this is a much smaller group relative to the others, but not when it comes to community change. So I can start to look at voice distribution, patterns within the data. I can use visualizations for less complex queries like this, or I could use a matrix for more complex queries. And again, we've stored one of these for you down here. I've coded for attitudes. When people are talking about the community, are they talking in a positive or negative way? Now I want to know when they talk about the natural environment, they could be saying either. So I want to find that out. So I build a matrix intersecting the codes for the natural environment with the other codes for community attitudes. And what I get is the intersection of those codes. So I can see here clearly that when it comes to water quality, the community is quite divided. You know, it's almost equally divided between sentiment. But when it comes to environmental impacts, it's almost all negative. When it comes to environment landscape, it's almost all positive. So I can see very nuanced differences. The habitat is negative, so are the environmental changes. So I can see nuanced differences across my themes, and I'm now looking across and between my themes, not just at a theme and describing it. So it's a much more in-depth analysis. And I could have put demographics in there rather than other codes. So I could have looked at age ranges or a whole range of things. I'd use the age range in the visualization because there was only a few codes. But if I had a lot of codes or a lot of age ranges, then I might want to use a matrix which is bigger. Now it does also chart. There's a chart there if I click on it. But it, you know, some of the charts work better than others. But I can also export this into the likes of Excel if I wanted to do tables, flowcharts, conditional formatting, different ways I may want to present this. Then I could do it in other ways. But the raw data coming out of NVivo is excellent. So these are all the various tools that I might use in analysis. So we've seen a matrix, we've seen attribute values, coding by hierarchy, we've seen various forms of charts, we've seen some mind maps, but I'm still in mind map mode because what I want to do with my final themes is I want to be able to see how these relate to each other. So if I go back down to my maps, we might have one here on the relationships across and between my final defined and named themes. So now I can see that balance is no longer sitting out on its own because what we're talking here is balancing these three things: industry, the economy, and the community. I can see that policy management and community change informs my community sub-theme, and that community in turn informs environmental changes, and that the environmental changes are informed by local identity, local connections, local knowledge, and the natural environment. So I'm drawing across and between my themes and I'm looking at the relationships between them. And generally conceptual maps go down very well with academics. Because I don't know if you've ever read anyone else's thesis, but I can tell you by the time you hit page 30, you've already forgotten what was on page 20. If I can show you a diagram, and here's a summary of what I just told you in the last 10 pages, I don't have to work as hard. It's much easier for me as a reader to understand complex things that you're explaining that might seem apparent to you in the argument that you're making in the text because you understand this world so well. You're 5 years immersed in it or whatever, but your reader won't be. So it makes it much easier for them to understand complex things. So we're using matrices, we're using maps, the various kinds of maps we've seen today. There's a couple of other quick diagrams here just to show you that are worth looking at, and just to understand the different ways you might want to look at data. So another thing I might want to do is I might want to look at a cluster analysis and look at the overlap between the discourse across these various topics. So up here in the Explore tab, I might want to do some diagrams and I might want to do a cluster analysis because I'm coding data. I'm thinking about meaning. I'm thinking about what somebody said, not whether they're a man or a woman or an older person or what else they talked about. I'm thinking in that moment about what they're saying there and then. Now I can look at this, I can look at clusters. So there's clusters building up in the background that I mightn't be aware of. So I can look at clusters in terms of files or codes. I'm going to do it on my coding. I'm not interested in word similarity because it was inductive coding. I know that people use inconsistent language. I didn't code for language use. I might use that if I were exploring literature or newspapers, but I trust my coding. And this was an inductive process, so it's the coding similarities I'm interested in. So I'm going to phase 6 here. and I'm going to take my 4 major themes and their sub-themes. Sorry, that's just a bit slow there. So I'm going to I'm not going to include the top level ones. I'm going to include all the ones below each of those broad areas. So I can just get a sense across all of these domains, where is the overlap? Now I get these are quick and easy to run. You learn this stuff fairly quickly. But I can see here now that, people talked about tourism, also talked about local knowledge. People who talked about renewable energy also talked to the natural variation. People who talked about the fishing industry also talked about aquaculture. Sense of community down change, local identity. So I can see where these overlaps occur in my coding that I mightn't be aware of. I could have just done it on some of the codes. I just did it on them all there to make something quick and easy. So there are various in the Explore tab here, diagrams that I might want to look at. I might want to look at, let's take a very simple diagram. I just want to see if I look at a code, who's coded there. So I might do an Explore diagram, and I can see at a glance who's coded in those interviews. And I can drill down on Barbara, and I can reverse the focus and see where else she's coded. So they're just quick and easy Explore tools that all help with these different overarching and overlapping processes. And then I think the other one I want to show you here is a comparison diagram. We'll be finishing up probably with that one because we're going to run out of time. So a comparison diagram might be where I wanted to see within the community, people who talk about, just widen that so we can see, community, the sense of community, do they talk about change as well? So if I go up here to my Explore model and I do diagrams, compare codes, and I go to my phase 6 coding, my analysis and write-up, and I look at community and take those 2 codes. This is what I get, quick and dirty visual. So the interesting phenomenon here that I mightn't have been aware of a minute ago is that almost everybody, I'm just going to remove the cases here, I'm just going to remove the files, who talks about coding, who talks about community, talks about community change. All of those guys in the middle talk about both. Only those few cases there talk about one, and one case over here talks exclusively about one or other of those. It's almost inevitable when they talk about the community, they then lead you into a conversation about change. So these are all just tools that we would use essentially to write our memos, and this is still very much a researcher-led activity. So, and then all of that will result in an audit trail that says, yep, I did the work, here's the evidence of it, and I did it in a manner consistent with Braun Clarke 2006-2020. So this is just a summary here of the various aspects, let's say, of NVivo that you might want to do. So there's notes, queries, visuals, and the different tools then within that you might want to apply. There's a recording of this, by the way, available. And don't forget to send an email if something that you want in terms of any resources. We would have lots of stuff on the Braun and Clarke papers, all that kind of stuff. Normally, we would now have a discussion about the challenges that you're going to face doing a thematic analysis. I know some of you may have already posed some questions there to Simon. I suppose that's really, I'm asking you to take that as a rhetorical question, really, and just ask yourself, what challenges do you face? Because some of them may be around understanding the philosophy, some of it, your epistemological and ontological understanding of where you're coming into, and it's important you understand that. And some of it could be more to do with the practical application. Okay, I get the Braun and Clarke thing, but how do I actually apply that? And is NVivo an appropriate tool to use? Should I use this? Would it be helpful? They're the kind of questions you would need to ask. Obviously, it goes without saying that I would say, yeah, why would you not use a tool? Braun and Clarke, by the way, are not big fans of CACTAS, computer-aided qualitative analysis methods, but I think that's more of a thing that some people just never got into it and don't really understand it. There's nothing you could do here that you couldn't do in a manual system. You're not doing anything different. It's just a little bit more efficiently and a lot more transparency. This is the general, it just really shows the extent to which NVivo, there's your research processes in pretty much all projects, and there's how NVivo dovetails into all of those. So there's a slide there that kind of explains that. And there's some really interesting stuff coming up in the near future. We've got some of them have been done, like Savannah's one has already been done, but these are all talks that are in the pipeline. If you're a member of the network, you'll be able to access any of these, and there's some heavy hitters there in terms of interesting talks. And there's podcasts available on your normal platforms, and there's my colleague Stacey Penna will regularly could do podcasts with really interesting characters. So it's definitely worth tuning into some of those. And of course, there's the broader community, and there you go. There's the normal share and connect, share and learn, connect. There's a whole range of resources there, and of course, there's things like funding opportunities. So join the community or tell others to do so if they can. The more in there, the better everybody, the more everybody gains from it. And that's just the 2 slides there to remind you of the email addresses for Simon, anything to do with the software, and me, anything to do with what we've just been talking about. So any last minute burning questions there, Simon?
I've never seen so many questions come in as we've had during this session, okay, by far and away the most. There's a couple, just to kind of clarify, because a number of people asking about R1, putting my proper QSR hat on, we don't call it R1, only Ben calls it R1. It is just NVivo for Windows or NVivo for Mac. The fact that it is release 1 under the covers is separate. It became available in March 2020. Those of you who've got university licenses, in the main, universities have to sign a little piece of paper for us to be able to release the new version to them. If they've signed it, you've got access to it. If they haven't, you can't. And in that case, bug them to sign it, because it is just a piece of paper. Questions wise, there were a number that came up that I don't think we'll have time to cover, but there was a thing about, let me just find the question again. It was about merging, what is the best age to merge files? There was a question about the mind maps and how they linked into the underlying data. And there were also a couple of questions about references by user and framework matrices, all of which look like big topics to me that I don't think we'll have time to cover in 2 minutes. Can I suggest, folks, if we've not been able to answer the question, then please drop us a line to either of those 2 email addresses, and we'll try to answer them. I think a number of the questions that came out suggest to me strongly that some of the further training we offer might be absolutely brilliant for you. There's a number of different options for training, and again, if you've got your software through university, they can possibly help with that. Any others that I spot, I will try and quickly answer in the next couple of minutes. Is it worth just covering off mind maps and how they link to the data?
Yeah, the two questions there. The mind maps, so there's 3 types of maps in NVivo: mind map, concept maps, and project maps. Mind maps are abstract from the data, so they're completely, you're free to do your thinking and exploring. Project maps are all about the data. You can drag in your codes, they're linked physically to the data, and they'll automatically connect up codes that are related to each other. And then the concept map allows you to apply both things. You could bring in shapes that represent concepts from literature, for example, or articles, and you could also, or theory, and you could also bring in the codes that you're seeing relate to that theory. And they're also linked to the data. So 2 of the 3 are linked physically to the data. Sorry, did you say there was a question on framework matrix?
Yeah, somebody's asking for a bit more detail on how it works. They find it exceptionally useful.
Okay, I wrote a paper with Marjorie Bonello. She's the head of the health sciences in University of Malta on conducting a framework analysis in NVivo. So if you send me an email, I'll send you back that paper, and it gives you a lot more detail. Now, she is actually applying the method framework analysis as opposed to the framework grid, which we demonstrated today, which is just one part of that. But it'll give you a view of what the framework grid is anyway. And as I said, in the context we used it today, it was in the context of doing TA, not framework analysis, but it is a tool that you would use during framework analysis. So we can send you all the information you want on that. I think we're done. Is that it?
I think so. I've been typing frantically trying to keep up with the questions. So if we have missed anything, folks, just drop one of us an email.
Okay, so you have the 2 email addresses there, and we'll get back to you by return. And if it had anything to do with the software, the different versions, at least Simon will tell you the right name for it, and anything to do with the training or the aspects of it, then I'll do as well. Okay, you can send them to me, and we'll cross over if there's a bit of both in them. Okay, so look, thanks for coming and for engaging. it's a lot to cover in an hour, so obviously we're a bit restrained, but it's better than not doing it, and it might whet your appetite to do a bit more learning and a bit more exploring. So thanks everybody for coming, and for Simon and indeed Stacey for organising everything in the background, and we'll talk to you possibly at the next webinar at some point in the future. Take care.
Cheers all.